Yes, hello once again. Welcome back to your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel here on YouTube, where of course we try our very best to rediscover more of those old school vintage race bikes from that bygone era of the 60s, 70s and 80s. And once again, thanks to all the brand new subscribers who have just recently signed up to CDB TV. We're not too far away from that 16,000 subscribers total. So again, if you've just recently signed up to my channel, then thanks for your support. So right now we're going to take a look at a bike that I came across at the recent Drumlanrig Castle Offroad Festival that we filmed in June, and this is another iconic machine from that early 1980s period. So without any further delay, let's jump straight into the video and take a look at this 1981 CR250 Honda Elsinore. Now, when Honda launched their brand new motocrosser in 1981, it's pretty fair to say that the off-road world hadn't really seen anything like it before, because these 81 CR250s were just a world apart from the old school air-cooled twin-shock bikes that had gone before. And this latest space-age off-road racer had a brand new light tubular steel chassis, and this was also Honda's first ever race bike with a single rear monoshock suspension system, and of course their first motocross 250 that had a water-cooled motor. Now, although this brand new Honda bike was bristling with the latest motocross technology of its day, and even on the track it was also a pretty quick machine once you learned how to ride it, but these new 81 250s weren't without their problems, and things like broken frames and dodgy gearboxes and clutches were just a few of the annoying niggles on what was still essentially a quite decent bike. Now, with the information that I gathered on this featured bike on the day that I grabbed these video clips and pictures, where that the bike was imported from Japan in 1981, and then it stood in a UK dealership window for its remaining life, and occasionally it would be removed and then taken to a local car park for a quick run around, and then of course it would be put back on display once again in the bike dealership's window until its next car park run. So after almost 40 years, this bike's never even been put on a racetrack. But beginning with the bike's chassis, which, as I said, was a tubular steel type construction, and although it was quite a well-designed frame, cracks and even major breakages of these chassis, it was quite a common complaint on these 81 bikes. But one of the other amazing statistics of these CR250s were that they were quite a heavy bike for a 250, and it were said to weigh even more than a big open class bike like the 490 Micro, for example. So although the bike didn't look like it, it still weighed a ton in comparison. And one of the other weird parts fitted onto these 250 Elsinores were this crazy style number plate, and our Japanese specification bike here has the Japanese style of front number plate fitted. But if you bought one of these bikes in the USA in that year, it would have had this new style of front plate fitted on the bike. Now, it's said that the angle and styling of this plate was to try and help to direct air into the bike's radiators, but a more plausible explanation of its styling was given some years ago by one of the Honda engineers who actually built these bikes, and he said that because many of these USA specification bikes were used in supercross events, naturally the crowds would be sitting high up in the stand, and so this plate was designed in order that spectators could look down and read the rider's number on the top. But when riders purchased these 81 250s, these number plates would be ripped off and then changed for a more conventional style plate as soon as they got the bike home. But in 1981, Honda water-cooled both their 125 and 250 motocrossers in that year, and this was their very first ever liquid-cooled motocross race bike, and most of this motor's technology was taken straight from their works bikes of that time. Now, the engine's bore, I think, as I remember, was a 66mm, and I think it had a stroke of 72 millimeters, and it also had that central exhaust port in the barrel. Now, the gearbox was a 5-speeder, and again, this was another problem area for this motor, and often it would jump out of third gear, or even worse still, break the cogs altogether, and often these gearboxes were thought to be made of cheese, as it was just so easy to break them up. Now, the clutches again took a lot of punishment, because you had to keep the motor on the pipe to try and get the best from it, so you had to have your left hand on the lever constantly slipping the clutch to keep the engine buzzing, and in extreme cases the clutch would overheat and eventually pack in altogether. And as powerful as this engine was, it was certainly not an easy power plant to tame. And again, if my aging memory still serves me correctly, I think in 1981 in stock trim, I'm pretty sure it was a 37mm key-in carburetor that was fitted onto these 250s, and it also fed the fuel into the engine through a quite sizable reed valve block. Now, the sparks for the motor's ignition system were supplied through a modern style pointless CDI electronic ignition system, and although this motor wasn't without its problems, if you could keep it in its mid-range where it did all of its best work, it could still hustle you around the racetrack. And again, another downside of the 81 250s were that the riders commented on in 1981 was that the front of the exhaust expansion chamber suffered quite a bit of damage during racing, mainly because it hung down well below the bottom frame rails. But of course, the upside was that on a cold day you could certainly keep your left leg nice and warm, and often too warm, as it scorched your race pants when they rubbed up against this quite hot exhaust pipe. And once again, the 250 Honda had two single alloy radiators, one at either side of the frame's front down tube, which they say was one of the factors that made this bike a little bit top heavy and quite awkward to handle. And normally there would be a black grille also there just underneath that front number plate, but it looks like it's missing on our featured bike. But those white air scoops are certainly all correct for that 1981 period. Now, Honda opted to fit Kayaba forks to their 1981 250s, which they thought at the time were a much better suspension system than the factory Showas on the previous Honda models. But the truth was that these 41mm Kayabas were nowhere near as good as the older Showa suspension units, and many riders often commented that they were just far too soft and they bottomed out too easily. Although there was some good news on the 1981 Elsinore, and that was that they had excellent brakes at both the front and at the rear, and these twin leading shoe stoppers were said to be among the best brakes on a 250 motocrosser in that year. And again, this rear brake also did its job superbly, and even with it being old school technology, this back brake certainly worked well in all manner of track conditions. Now, once again, another first for Honda in 81 was when they changed from their conventional twin-shock rear end to this brand new Pro Link single rear shock type of swing arm, which was the very first time anyone had really seen a single shock rear end on a Honda dirt bike. And although this was brand new technology, these alloy swing arms were a bit prone to breaking and cracking at the welds, although as the years went on, Honda would strengthen and improve this design to become one of the best rear suspensions in motocross. Now, our featured Honda bike still has its original Japanese shock that was fitted to the bike in 1981, and this was bolted onto the rear swing arm by way of a rising rate linkage system. But again, the shock's remote gas and oil reservoir was bolted onto the outside of the chassis, and although this was seen to be outer limits new technology for its day, it offered very little in the way of suspension adjustment. But as a teacher used to say to me at school long ago, it's not bad for a first attempt. Of course, we had a plastic fuel tank for that 1981 year, which is just as well, because even with all of the plastics that were bolted onto this bike, it still hit the scales at around 240 plus pounds, which made it quite a plump little racer. But still, this fuel cell normally held around just over 2 gallons of pre-mixed fuel, so it was usually enough to feed that 250 engine with all of the gas that it required. Now, I've certainly never had the opportunity to ride one of these 81 250s, so I've no idea whatsoever how comfortable they were with regards these type of seats. But then again, at the end of the day, these are off-road racing motorcycles, so comfort's certainly secondary in terms of the bike's handling and speed over the ground. But these 81 seats certainly have the look of quite a good place to rest your backside down on between the whoops. And so as we get to the business end of our 250, again, all of our bike's controls are the very same parts that were fitted at the Honda factory back in the day. And although the bike's maybe not 100% authentic, I'll still wager that at least 98% of this machine is still factory fresh from that year, because it does look like it's got the stock handlebars, cables, levers and grips all fitted to the bike as well. But 1981 again would also be the very last year that Honda used the Elsinore prefix on their motocrossers, a title that of course served them very well since their introduction back in 1973. But overall, the 1981 CR250 was certainly full of big ideas and innovations for the start of the 1980s, although this new style water-cooled motor, although still very powerful, it really had nothing at the bottom end and a very narrow power band mid-range, which was quite hard to keep in check. Although despite all of the innovations on these brand new 81 250s, they certainly weren't Honda's finest hour, and that statement can be quite easily backed up by just attending any modern day vintage or even classic scramble event, and you can almost guarantee that you'll not see one of these race bikes still taking to the track. But having said that, they're still quite collectible as a showpiece bike, purely because of the brand new technology that came with these AT1 bikes. But in terms of a race machine, they were just far too heavy, and of course the reliability of the chassis and the internals of the motor were also questionable. But as I said, these are still extremely rare bikes, and this example here is without doubt another collector's piece that would look great just sitting alongside a swarm of other rare and collectible off-road classics. But as far as putting this bike back onto a racetrack, then I would say just forget it, because this bike has much more value just sitting here in its untouched and unmolested original 1981 condition. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. A quite rare walk around a very rare bike indeed, a 1981 CR250 Honda Elsinore, a machine that you almost never ever see on racetracks these days, and that particular example there is a very nice and rare bike indeed, and that was another one of the bikes, as I said, that I spotted at the recent Drumlanrig Castle Offroad Festival weekend. So coming up next here on CDB TV, we'll be packing our camera gear up again and heading down to Penrith to cover the penultimate race event of the Scottish Classic motorcycle racing season, and that will be round 6 of their championship. And of course I'll be bringing you all of the bikes and all of the racing from that event here on my channel. So if you haven't already subscribed to CDB TV, then I do hope you will do that very small thing shortly, in order that you don't miss out on any future videos that I post. So until the next time, everybody out there in vintage motocross land, be safe and well while you're riding those old classic motocross bikes, and I hope to see you back here again very soon, so we can talk about more of this old style vintage iron right here on your #1 and favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.